Even days later, James's eyes still seemed to be transfixed onto the picture on Sheeda's arm, even after having seen it plenty of times. And so, they also were, as they sat tightly packed in two large vehicles with darkly tinted windows. They were heading towards their destination at a steady, swift pace. "Is this the point where I tell you to take a picture so you can stare even longer?" Sheeda teased him, and lightly nudged against his shoulder with her other arm, causing his attention to snap away from the tattoo as he looked up to her face, his dark eyes meeting hers while they were still stuck in a sort of wistful expression. After a second, he blinked a few times and his gaze returned to normal as he shook his head slightly. "Sorry," he said, and awkwardly scratches his neck while leaning back a bit so he wouldn't be intruding on her personal space as closely anymore. This is still a bit hard to believe." Although James was fully aware that people's opinions and worldviews could change over time and again, it seemed that he was just the tiniest bit stumped whenever it actually happened. For a moment, Sheeda almost got worried that her decision to overcome her own upbringing and let the needle touch her skin was somehow making him uncomfortable. "You don't like it?" she therefore asked, although she had obviously asked it many times already, and although she knew his usual answer, she still looked down at the picture slightly self-consciously. "I love it," James quickly assured her once again, and leaned over to her so he could hold her with one arm. Sheeda embraced the embrace, and pressed her head against him while allowing her weight to fully slump against his body, only slightly hindered by the seatbelt wrapped around her. "I'm just still a bit overwhelmed that it's real." Letting out a purring chuff, Sheeda broke into the slightest snicker. "Well, feel free to stare as much as you want until you're sure it's real," she informed him, and lifted the inked arm to tenderly glide across his cheek with her fingertips. "But don't forget that I'm more than just a tattoo, and other parts of me want attention as well." While James released an amused breath and turned ever so slightly red around his nose, a throat was loudly clear from a seat in front of them. "We're probably going to be there soon," the hoarse voice of Flynn informed them, while the old man seemed to entirely transfix his eyes onto the road in front of them, while their driver impassively went about his work without so much as even slightly acknowledging the display happening behind him. "You two should probably get ready to face the crowds. I think it's going to be unpleasant." James still looked a bit sheepish as he pulled away from Sheeda again, and started to make sure his clothes and hair were still in order, with some simple swipes of his hand. Sheeda, on the other hand, had decided to not be at all embarrassed about her affectionate side, now that they were fully stepping out in front of the galaxy. If cameras were about to be on them at all times soon, then she was more than happy to present the people with a Miat who was completely happy and confident in who and what she was, and the people around her enjoying it. "Want a bit of powder to freshen up?" a voice then asked from behind them, as Coco poked her head out from in between their seats, leaning forth from the row behind them. Although she had a clearly impish look on her face, most likely from having thoroughly enjoyed bearing witness to the tender moment before, her voice sounded earnest and helpful as she made the suggestion. However, James shook his head as he wiped his hair into shape with the tips of his mechanical fingers. "I think I'm good," he replied, carefully tapping at his forehead with his fleshy hand, seemingly testing for built-up sweat. Although, seemingly needing confirmation for his own judgment, he then turned completely to look back at the people riding behind them. "How do I look?" Coco and Admir both lifted their hands to their chins and gently rubbed them as they studied him with narrowing eyes, their gaze gliding up and down while scanning over his well-groomed appearance. The grey suit he was wearing was immaculate. His hair was cut to a nice short do, and even his short, stubbly beard had been shaved into a sharp, clear form. All in all, James had not looked this put together in a long time. Likely seeing that there wasn't much to criticize, the two humans briefly glanced at each other, and exchanged a brief and subtle nod as their eyes met. and although James was obviously looking for a bit more of a professional answer, they then opened their mouth at the same time in an obviously somehow pre-choreographed way, as they synchronously stated, "I'd fuck you." Not quite keeping his composure, James's head dropped slightly, and he released a single laughing huff, while resisting the idea of encouraging them by showing any more positive reaction than that. Meanwhile, Sheeta had no such qualms and therefore freely allowed herself to heartily laugh at the bizarre responses, while Flynn's eyes seemed to concentrate on the road all the more now, his expression telling Sheeta that the man was only now fully realizing with exactly who he and his nephew were sharing a car right now, clearly becoming suddenly aware of his protégé's past exploits. Enjoying the successful joke, Admir leaned back in his seat, and now his demeanour seemed to be ready to also return to professionalism. "Well, it's not like looking nice is going to change anyone's mind now," he explained under his breath, while looking at the darkened windows of their transport. And already, the early beginnings of a crowd could be seen as they approached their destination. His dark eyes twinkled slightly as he took in the gathering people. Next to him, Coco also dropped her impish expression, and her sharp features now turned into a stern and well-practiced mask. Her green eyes turned stone cold as they followed Admir's gaze. "So many idiots," she mumbled to herself, displeased, as the crowd grew larger and larger as they drove by. "Half of all people are dumber than the average person," Admir commented with a sigh. "That makes 5 billion on Earth alone." His eyes then tore away from the window as he looked forwards again. "Are you holding up, James?" he asked, and stared at James's profile from behind, since James's gaze had also returned to looking ahead. Sheeta watched as James took a deep breath, and she noticed a hint of a quiver in there that was most likely inaudible to humans, but was picked up by her ears easily enough. "Yeah," James then replied with a stern nod, that seemed to be directed at himself. Sheeta reached out to take his hand and grabbed it tightly. Although she was in the same situation as him in a way, she found it hard to empathize with his state of mind. After all, while all those people gathering there outside were most likely just as happy to hate her as they were to direct their anger at James, ultimately, she wasn't the one all those signs and yells out there were directed at. The caricature of James telling people there was nothing to be concerned about, while flanked by armed faceless soldiers, among others, appeared to be an especially popular motive on many of them, whenever they weren't straight-out insults. James usually didn't easily let stuff get under his skin, but with hundreds if not thousands or more people coming for him like this, it was likely that it didn't go entirely past him without leaving a mark. Soon, their vehicle finally pulled up to the side of the road, right in front of a large building. Their driver immediately got out of the car and hurried around it to begin unloading their luggage, while everyone else remained inside just a moment longer. Although, the moment that the first door was opened, the shouting and jeering and chanting from the outside could be heard. By now, thick masses of people surrounded them on basically all sides, held at bay by steel barricades that were guarded by orderlies who made sure nobody would try to jump them. Highly equipped officers with every kind of early threat detection imaginable attached to their helmets were patrolling along the crowds, and even many of the surrounding buildings, especially those that could get a clear view on the scene easily, had been partially closed down for a brief time, while the procession heading for near Stantiot Station approached the spaceport. Originally, they had of course been supposed to simply depart from one of the military's many private ports to avoid a situation exactly like this. However, after the celebration of Sheeta's promotion, they had all come together with some of Earth's higher political figures that supervised this whole endeavour, including Representative Kumar. And together, they had come to the conclusion that they couldn't keep hiding away anymore. This was an incredibly public endeavour, and they couldn't try to execute it behind a held-up hand. Not if they ever wanted to win the trust of the people for themselves. Taking one last deep breath, James closed his eyes for a moment, while his grip on Sheeta's hand intensified briefly. Then he let go, and turned to open the car door. And Sheeta was quick to follow him. Immediately, a wave of sound hit James as he stepped outside into the dusty city air. With this many people around and on their feet, every little bit of dirt or debris that had collected on these streets over the years had now been disturbed and whirled up into the air, giving everything a dusty tinge. Well, the burning objects that some of the protesters were carrying with them, that they tried to use to set all kinds of different symbolic imagery ablaze while constantly releasing smoke, also didn't help. Although, admittedly, James did get the tiniest bit of absolutely petty enjoyment out of observing that many of them had seemingly bought old and retired UHSDF memorabilia of one form or another with them to try and burn them in front of him. And not only was he in no way attached to any of the uniforms, flags, or other items that they tried to get at him with in the least, they also were quite obviously made to be entirely fireproof, and watching the modified silk most of the items were made of entirely refused to even glimmer in the flames was in a cosmic sense amusing. But of course, that was just a very minimal comfort when compared to the mass of other, and often admittedly more effective measures they brought forth. Their yelling alone was bad enough. As soon as he had shown his face, the crowd obviously erupted in renewed vigour to let him know exactly how they felt. Most of the voices meshed and merged together so that it all turned into a single, aggressive drone that crashed against him like a wave of hostile sound. Although every now and then, when one of the protesters yelled out with especially much vigour, or sometimes simply had an especially annoying voice, some of the sentences would actually make it to his ear untouched. "You don't speak for us! If you want what's best for us, you won't come back! Do us all a favour and let them finish the job this time! Go, and don't return! You should be the one behind bars!" While his luggage was brought over to him, James stopped for a moment. And although he didn't really want to do it, he allowed his gaze to glide over the crowd. Among them, he couldn't find any common features. They were all perfectly normal people, looking like they should be going about their normal life. Even just glancing around, he saw all shapes, sizes and races coming together here. Some people had even brought their children, he noticed, as he saw a little girl in a frizzy pink dress, with her brown hair bound into loose pigtails, and seemingly cluelessly holding up a sign that read, "Sanctity is death." All walks of life were united here, brought together only by their desire to tell him personally how much they despise him right now. Hundreds of people, if not thousands, none of whom he had ever seen. He had not spoken 3 words to any of them, and yet they were all here. "Are you ready?" a voice suddenly said at his side, pulling him out of his thoughts. Turning his head, his eyes met with the deep blue gaze of Athena, who had seemingly walked over from her own car to see what was keeping him, while his own company had just quietly gathered around him to allow him a moment. Following the direction she had come from, his eyes scanned over the other people that were also waiting for him. Nia, Tuya, and Andrej all stood together, their suitcases already in their hands as they looked back at him with neutral faces, but worry in their gazes. Then, turning his head yet again, he looked at the people that were with him. "Yeah," he said once again, and quickly picked up the suitcase that had been set down next to him with his mechanical hand, before starting to walk at a brisk pace towards the entrance of the spaceport, with everyone else soon beginning to follow him. Out of all of them, Nia definitely looked the most uncomfortable at the crashing waves of jeering and chanting coming from the crowd as they moved past it, not quite able to keep up with the professionals around her when it came to keeping her hurt and worry at so many people just hating in check. Constantly, she glanced around at everything and kept her arms close to her body, as if protectively embracing herself. Finn's expression also shifted a lot, though he seemed less concerned about the emotions brewing up inside himself, and more restrainedly furious at the people around him, as his teeth gritted and lips shifted constantly, while he darkly glanced at seemingly specific people he picked out of the crowd. Meanwhile, the soldiers around them kept up a stony facade, and after the first assessment of the crowd, most of them tried to not even spare a passing glance at the people who had come here to cause them trouble, not deeming it worth their attention. Even the constant flashing of cameras from all around didn't bother them after a while. Although, they didn't quite have a 100% success rate, and every now and then an especially loud call or especially creative display of disdain did catch their attention for the briefest moment, as they turned their head for only seconds before coming to their senses and looking on again. The same was almost true, as they had nearly reached the door, when a sudden piercing whistle, much like one you could often hear in the cheers of the winning side after a successful sports match, cut through the air so loudly that James couldn't quite help but turn his head momentarily. He was about to tear his gaze away again, right away, and he also would have done so, had the one brief look not instantly sparked recognition within him. Bringing his eyes back onto the whistling person, James's expression shifted to surprise, because there, right at the front and clamping their hands onto the steel barrier, separating them from the procession, stood Simon and Nicola, their orange and lime green hair sticking out of the crowd and catching James's attention. At first, he was confused what those two were doing in a crowd like this. However, as he took a moment to look around them, he began to notice that that part of the masses of people was different. "Support our people! United against unity! For a brighter tomorrow! And we'll carry it with you!" were only some of the held-up signs that he spotted among them, and even scanning over the people's faces, he quickly got an entirely different picture of them than the one he had had before. These people had the same biting determination on their faces as those he had seen earlier, but what was entirely missing was the dark, pressing hostility. Indeed, many of them even lit up as their gazes actively met his, often shouting something out with wide smiles on their faces, or simply waving once they noticed his attention on them. And just as before, there was no common denominator between them. These were all perfectly normal people, who should have been going about their normal lives. Stopping his trudging along towards the port just before he had reached it, James moved off to the side. Some of the securing officers around him briefly came in his direction in concern. However, he quickly waved them away as he approached the barrier unrestrainedly. "What are you doing here?" he asked the two net celebrities out in front, as there was a bit of cheering coming from the crowd, seemingly celebrating his approach. Nicola's face lit up as she swiped some of her extremely long green hair over her shoulders. "Seen you off," she announced, while Simon took a step back to, of course, get all of this in a better angle with his raised camera. James briefly lifted his gaze, once again letting it glide over the second crowd. Now he also saw that these people were, in fact, also separated from the others with additional barriers, most likely to keep some form of peace between them. "Did you do all of this?" James then asked, genuinely impressed at the outcome, figuring the influencers must have used their, well, influence to gather people for this sort of counter-protest. "You could say that," Nicola began, seemingly trying to ride the high of James's impressed tone. However, Simon was quick to rain on her parade. "Well, not really," the cameraman informed James, while lifting the device to seemingly get a close-up of his face. "We did announce that we would come here to try to see you off, but the event basically organized itself. We had a minimal hand in that." "Then why are all these people—" James began. However, he didn't get to finish the sentence, as he was interrupted by a cheeky hand lightly slapping against his shoulder. "Well, duh," Coco announced, as she walked up next to him, her earlier stony expression briefly breaking back into his preferred jovialness. "It's not like the entire world is against you." Soon, she was followed by the rest of his team and family, all of whom took up position behind James, James glanced back at all of them standing behind him, before once more looking out over the crowd. Not the entire world was against them. Had he really forgotten that at some point? Unwillingly, an uncomfortable memory shot through James's head. Hundreds pushing a train to free a single person. Thousands marching the streets for any single topic they are passionate about. Millions of deaths over nothing more than pieces of land. Again, millions sold and treated as nothing more than property, believed to be less than others based on just the colour of their skin. Millions tortured to death under horrendous circumstance because of something as immaterial as religion. Billions coming together, rallying against a disease that has plagued their people for too long. Once again billions, banding together against an enemy bigger than themselves, correcting the mistake of a single group of people in a war that lasted almost a decade, and ending in the most hard-fought victory humanity has ever won, as they conquered the manifested might of their own ambition in the form of one of the most dangerous realized artificial sapiens that the galaxy has ever seen. A species so volatile that it decided the best way to gain peace would not be through collaboration, but through mutually assured destruction, and yet they still managed to build the foundation of unity on top of such an arrangement. Any one of these events would have been calamitous amongst the vast majority of the species in this galaxy, yet humanity has yet to go a century without one like them. HFY had said that she was obsessed with humanity for this very reason. This one singular trait that seemed to be able to move their entire species. She had believed it could be directed by others to better suit their needs. James closed his eyes for a moment. He heard all the people that had gathered both in front of and behind him. Some wishing to block his path, some wishing to see where it would lead. It was by no means the whole world yet, but it still seemed like humanity had reached a fork in the road. Maybe HFY had been right. Maybe humanity did just need something to set it into motion. However, as a people, they would not dance to the tune these people dictated. He was going to make sure of that. Opening his eyes, he looked directly into Simon's camera. "Thank you all for being here," he announced, with his face opening up his expression to sincere vulnerability. "Your support means a lot." There were slight cheers going through the crowd before him, as Simon took another step back and briefly glanced down at the camera, making some quick inputs, before lifting it back up and looking over the entire group that was with James. "Could we get a picture as the headliner?" he asked with enthusiasm, and briefly glanced out from behind his device. James was about to open his mouth to reply. However, before he could, he already heard the sound of fabric being pulled off skin all around him, as 7 arms were already smoothly and damn near synchronously free from their sleeves, before being stretched up towards the sky, the backs of their hands pointing towards the crowd. And with them, the pictures that were immortalized underneath them. James nearly scoffed at the display, admittedly kind of dumbfounded at just how ready everyone, but him, had seemingly been for this. However, before he could question it in any measure, he was suddenly nudged and prodded from all over, as a lot of quiet, hushed "come-ons" being directed at him, as he still stood like he normally did. Briefly glancing around, he saw a lot of determinedly sparkling eyes looking back at him, as arms remained raised upwards. Sheeta especially flicked her ears at him in an almost demanding gesture, impatiently waiting for him to finally join in with them all. So, this is becoming a thing now, James thought to himself, as he began to pull on his own sleeve with a sigh. Then, with vigour, he too thrust his hand skywards. Simon quickly got himself into position, and James could hear a storm of shutters, as the young man seemingly took a torrent of pictures to make sure he wouldn't miss the perfect shot. And soon, his camera wasn't the only one, as the clicking sounds of all kinds of devices, together with a regular old lightning storm of camera flashes, erupted to capture the moment of the posing group. And among those who weren't trying to get the picture branded onto a hard drive, Many soon began to copy the gesture, raising and turning their left arm. Although they were of course missing the united picture that the original shared, the imitation was still clear in its show of support. Further off behind them, they could hear a renewed jeering and yelling breaking out among the other group of protesters, as they reacted quite allergically to the display. However, it didn't matter. Not right now. Soon, they let their arms sink back down, their hands quickly reaching for their luggage as the storm of flashes died down. "We really ought to go now," James informed the influencers, and the masses behind them, as he lifted his suitcase. "Keep Earth in one piece until we are back." "Count on it!" Nicola replied enthusiastically, bumping her fist up in front of the camera once again, before eagerly waving as the group began to return to their original path. "Safe travels!" Using his free hand, James also waved with the back of his hand, many of his companions doing the same. Finn, who was stood off to the side for most of the interaction, stared over at his nephew. James could see a distinct look of pride in his old eyes, as the wrinkles around them deepened. Once they had made their way inside to the port, he and Nia turned towards Finn, as the rest of the group stepped away slightly, though Sheila gave James a quick squeeze before she did. "Stayed a bit longer than I wanted," James began, as he looked into his uncle's eyes. "But I'll be going now." Finn exhaled slowly. "And this time you're taking your sister, too," he said exasperatedly, with his gravelly voice. "What are you doing to me, kid?" Without waiting for an answer, Finn then quickly moved in for a hug, pulling both his kids into a tight embrace, holding one with each arm. "The next time I come back, it'll be for good," James promised, as his hand closed on his uncle's back, grabbing a fistful of the fabric of his jacket while he tried to keep his emotions in check. There was a chance that it would be a long, long time until then, but he still meant it. "Don't break everything while we're away," Nia said, as she held on tightly as well, pressing her face into the old man's shoulder. "And by Mamon's greed, get yourself some help with the compound. We're not hurting for money." Finn laughed roughly. "Over my dead body," he declared, as they eventually let go of each other. James looked at him sternly. "But really, don't do anything stupid while we're out there," he said with a firm voice. "There's help out there for whatever you might need it for. Don't hesitate to search it." Finn exhaled again, deeply. "I know, kid," he said, and once again he looked much older than he actually was. However, when he then looked up again, the firmness in his eyes couldn't have been rivaled by any younger man, as they stared at each of them. "And you two, be safe out there," he demanded deeply. "You're together. You have each other's backs. And you both have some fine ladies at your side. Don't let anything happen to them, or to either of you on your watch. Got it?" The siblings both grinned and nodded firmly. Finn now also broke a smile. "How's your blood?" he asked the two of them, causing the siblings to chuckle. "Flows like water," they synchronously replied, before jumping in for another, this time much quicker hug. "I'm going to miss you," Flynn said, as he held them. "We're going to miss you too," both siblings assured him in return. Then, they let go of each other, and Finn immediately turned away from them, and lifted a hand to his face. "All right, get out of here," he ordered them, and used his free hand to wave them along. "And show those jokers what for." Reaching out, both James and Nia quickly and gently jabbed against his chest with their fists, before picking up their suitcases and hurrying after everyone else, ready to depart this planet. "Oh, my goodness," Moore commented, with a claw raised to her mouth, as she tilted her head so one of her large eyes could inspect the exposed forearm that Sheila was enthusiastically holding up to her.
What an adorable sentiment, although I can hardly believe you actually went to this extreme.
Sheeda smirked deviously. And extreme? She asked, with a lightly mocking tone while she let her arm sink down again, once the old lady had gotten a good look at it. Losing an arm would be extreme. This is nothing. James glanced up as her specific phrasing sparked some recognition in his mind, and the way she suggestively flicked her ears in his direction indicated that it may have not been his imagination. Meanwhile, he found himself face to face with the red glowing eyes of a very familiar cyborg. I would like to ask you if it is true, Curie said, after their first greeting and embrace was over, and James figured that they were talking about the idea of him actually talking to an artificial sapient. James did not know if Curie had any specific thoughts on the beings of data, but he could only imagine they would at least be, well, curious about them. Still, the cyborg added to their statement, But I am aware that you likely cannot tell, whatever is the case. I'm very sorry, Curie, James said, and scratched at his neck. After all, he knew their thoughts on secrets. However, Curie simply shook their body. It is all right, they said. I should likely not be trusted with information like that either way. James looked up at that, ready to say something to the opposite effect. However, he stopped as he noticed that the cyborg's words contained no hidden pain or sense of self-loathing. It had been one of their entirely sober statements on their part, and they appeared to be perfectly content with that. Man, we missed a lot, didn't we? James mumbled to himself, as his eyes got transfixed on Curie's pitch-black surface. Then, he shook his head, as he remembered something. Right. How did your problems with Narrator go? Is everything cleared up? Curie looked back at him with their unmoving gaze. It has been cleared up, they stated almost ominously. And the fact that they did not add to that likely indicated that they could also not quite talk about what exactly that involved. He really had missed a lot. For a moment, James just stood there and quietly stared at the cyborg. Hey, Curie? He then asked, after a few moments. Yes? They replied quickly, their artificial voice picking up slightly. Could I get another hug? I don't think I've had enough yet, James stated, and opened his arms invitingly. Wordlessly, Curie complied and moved up to him, allowing his arms to close around their metal body. He knew they weren't all for this sort of contact, so he appreciated them accommodating him, as he gently patted their back between the joints of their massive legs. All the while, a struggle could be heard not too far off, as a female voice clearly strained with all of her might against something. However, ultimately, her efforts appeared to be in vain, as Athena's voice could be heard loudly proclaiming, All right, fine, I yield. Fuck! Glancing over as he let go of Curie, James looked just in time to see how Conglorch removed one of his massive maulers from Athena's back, seemingly allowing her to get up again, after holding her down with it for a while. As the blonde Amazon stood up and dusted herself off, she briefly glanced over to James before pointing at the enormous reptile. You beat that guy? She loudly asked in clear disbelief at that fact. How? James laughed loudly and tried to put on a smug face for a moment, before completely breaking his facade and admitting in complete honesty. Because he had no idea how to fight humans when I did. Had he fought as smart as he does now, I wouldn't have stood a fucking chance. It had been James's saving grace back then that Conglorch had tried to subdue him by squeezing him of all things, which was the one way the human could clearly overpower the reptile. Had the giant simply stepped on him like he had done with Athena, James would have been just as flat. Conglorch's eyes then shifted over to James, all four of them narrowing down onto the human. Would you like a rematch then, dancer? He offered in a low boom, and made an almost threatening step towards James. However, James just shrugged with a sigh. "Come," he announced. And while his arm was still raised, he let sparks fly from his fingers to demonstrate the why of that statement. Too dangerous. In the end, the strength of the arm was much more concerning than the built-in taser was, but the lightning made for a better demonstration. It was then that Admir approached James from the side, a tablet in his hand, as he stared down at the screen. "So, I'm assuming correctly that we want to be nowhere near the provided accommodations, right?" he suggested, with a hint of comedy in his voice as he swiped away at the device. "Correct," James said with a snap of his fingers. "Might be a hard sell," Admir informed contemplatively, while seemingly scanning over the data he had at his disposal. "There's a bunch of events on that station around the same time. Seems to be a real hotspot for social gatherings of all kinds. Most hotels and stuff are booked out." James thought for a moment, before turning to glance at the screen. "Is there a Rouge Gak hive on the station?" he asked, and encouraged Admir to look it up. After a few inputs, they had their answer. "Well, there you go."